Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the question of can the government refuse to implement their own laws? Does the executive in Canada have a veto power? And a recent Court of Appeal decision that suggests no, they do not. Now, Paul, can you explain why this principle is so important? I've tried to walk through, if the legislature passes a law, they don't get to just not implement it, they have to actually repeal it. But why does this matter from a democratic perspective? Why do you think people should actually care about this case, which we've described as a little antiseptic?
Well, one thing that's important, and the court ends up making this point very clearly, is that in our constitutional system, ministers and other actors in the administrative state don't have unfettered discretion. They don't have untrammeled, arbitrary power to do as they wish. They must act within the confines of the law. And if the legislature has passed a statute and gives the executive the authority to bring that statute into force, well, that's not a power that can be exercised arbitrarily or for fear of political embarrassment. It's a power that has to be exercised in conformity with the limits set down by the legislature. And that's a fundamental principle in our constitutional system.
Sujit, anything you want to add to that about why you think the average citizen should care about what happened in this case and maybe the broader implications if the court had found the other way?
Well, what's interesting is that these commencement provisions are very widespread in Canadian law, and so we observed that in at least 50 Ontario statutes at present, there are unproclaimed commencement provisions, and they're used in over 400 Ontario and federal statutes.
Suji, let me just stop you because I don't think we've explained to the viewer what the concept of a commencement provision actually is and what role it played in this case. We're sort of talking about how mechanically in the law,
Right.
how did they justify not proclaiming this law? And it relates to this commencement provision. Can you explain that?
Yeah, of course. So there's a clause in the Act which says that it comes into force in a day to be named by proclamation of the Lieutenant Governor. And what that translates into in kind of plain English is that once the law kind of passes through the legislative process and it's granted royal assent, so it's actually a law in the statute books, um, the law itself, the only provision that is actually effective is the provision that grants a discretion to the cabinet to decide when to bring the rest of the law into force, and that's called a commencement provision. And there's really good reasons to have commencement provisions. They basically give governments time to prepare the groundwork to implement laws. Sometimes there's a lot of the regulations that need to be enacted, people need to be trained, policy manuals need to be produced. Laws, it's not necessarily a good idea for a law to come into force on day one. And so commencement provisions are a good thing. I think the issue is the one that Paul said, which is that the commencement provision is basically it creates a duty to kind of implement the law within a reasonable time frame. It's not a veto that says that once the law is passed by cabinet, they shouldn't implement it. And the reason people should care is that in a democracy, the most visible part of the political decision making is what the legislature does when it makes laws. And when laws are enacted, the people believe that the law is going to be implemented. And when it's not, when laws aren't kind of brought into force, that's a kind of a secret process. There's no visibility in it, and and people can be quite frankly misled as to what the state of the law is and what they thought their politicians are doing.
Now, you mentioned this, Suji, but these commencement provisions that the government relied on to say, well, we're not going to implement the law. Um, these, as you said, there are hundreds of them in statutes,
Yes.
in hundreds of statutes. They're pervasive in Canadian law. Paul, do you know how often it is that governments are not implementing laws on this basis? This is not the only case where this has happened. Now, we've only got about 45 seconds for this answer, but we can pick it up after the break. Just briefly, how common is this?
I'd say it's very common, Christine. There's a website called Canly where you can look at legislation, and the bits of legislation that has been made but not actually proclaimed into force, they're shaded in grey on the CanLII website. And if you pick a statute, particularly complex administrative statutes, you'll see an awful lot of grey on the screen as you scroll down. There are an awful lot of unproclaimed provisions in Canadian law, passed by the legislature but never brought into force by the executive.
Fascinating. I want to pick back up on this topic with Sujit when we come back from the commercial break.